Just a fair warning before the video begins. This video will not be spoiler free. I'll be going over my thoughts of this book, including spoilers. So, I recently finished reading a book called Spaceman of Bohemia. Sorry if I butcher this name, but I think it's by Yaroslav Kalfar. Don't know, that's my attempt at pronouncing his name. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it. Disclaimer, it has been 3 months since I read this book. But it's a book that really made me think. So I wanted to leave it for a while, give it some time to stew in my brain, because I really had a lot of thoughts about it. And to be honest with you, I've not processed a lot of what I thought about it. It's still a book that perplexes me in some ways, even now. And I think that if you talk to other people who've read this book, that's probably a bit of a theme with this book, among multiple people's experiences reading it. And it's also left a really strong impression on me compared to pretty much most sci-fi novels I've ever read. It drew me in a way very few books I've ever read have, for a lot of reasons, but I'll get into those. So, as usual, I'm going to talk about the things that I liked about it, the stuff that left a strong impression on me, that kind of thing. Hopefully this will be a bit shorter than my other videos. I've said that every time, but this is a much shorter book, and there's a lot less to talk about in general. Actually, that's not true. I could rant on for ages about all the different things there are to talk about, but I'm not going to, because I want to make a relatively precise video like I did with my Murdermob books, book videos. Again, Spaceman of Bohemia. I'm going to talk about it now. First, I want to start with a quick summary of the book's premise. So this book is a science fiction novel, and it follows a Czech astrophysicist who becomes an astronaut named Jakub. And the premise is essentially that there is a cloud of this mysterious space dust that was created by a comet in our solar system. And this cloud of dust became known as the Chopra, and the Chopra kind of paints the sky purple at night when the light comes through it, and this has kind of captured the imagination, admiration, and academic interests of scientists across the globe, including our main character Jakub, who was an astrophysicist in the past. The new Czech Prime Minister approaches Jakub at some point in the past, who has since become the leading expert on Chopra and has developed somewhat of an obsession with it himself. Is asked to become the first spaceman of Bohemia, or rather the first Czech astronaut. And the Prime Minister basically tells him he has a desire to create a Czech space program, to make the country the first country to reach the Chopra cloud and bring back samples. And basically they want to put the Czech Republic back on the national stage, essentially. And the book begins with Jakub being fired into space aboard a spaceship called the Jan Hus, which I believe is named after a philosopher who is mentioned in the book quite a few times, and theologian. And from there, Jakub narrates his 8-month journey to the Chopra cloud, isolated and alone aboard this ship, only his own fraying mind and thoughts for company. And the book explores Jakub's motivations and reasoning for leaving behind his seemingly happy life with his wife Lenka on a space mission that has a high likelihood of ending in his death through these fantastically vivid flashbacks and these riveting stream of consciousness kind of prose and storytelling. Jakub introspects on his past, essentially. And from there the story unfolds. That's basically the book. Jakub is also the child of a communist informer back when the country was under the control of the Soviets, and our main character lived through the revolution that led to, obviously, the country being freed from communism. And that is a major theme throughout this book, and Jakub harbours a kind of hereditary guilt and shame for his father's part to play in the history of his country, and a big motivation for why he wants to go on this space journey is partially to redeem himself for the actions of his father, and also to escape his life in a way that he's kind of not very content with. And as the book goes on, we learn that Jakob is not a reliable narrator. We learn that he is not the greatest husband in the world. We learn that he's a deeply insecure and damaged person. And this book kind of formulates a character study almost of Jakob, and also explores some ideas about the meaning of life, free will, some deep philosophical concepts really that I thought the novel did a really good job of touching on. The book, it reminds me in a way of these kind of like whimsical stories where characters go on these crazy adventures and they learn something deep or fundamental about what it means to live. Films like, Forrest Gump, Big Fish, that kind of like dig into the human condition, and the characters go through these crazy events that are just unbelievable and in a way absurd, like very absurd and silly and not necessarily realistic at all. But when you read it, it somehow feels grounded and serious in its overall tone, despite its absurdity. Because when you take a moment to step back and think about this book and the things that happen in it, it is quite wacky and absurd. But the tone and the way that it's delivered and the storytelling is delivered is very, very serious, morose, and otherwise just fucking great, to be honest with you. So I think I'll talk a little bit about the characters. I'll talk a little bit about the plot. That's my summary of the book, I suppose. If you wanted to know how I feel about this book, I fucking loved it. I'm on a bit of a roll recently with books that I really liked. This book I thought was fucking great. Honestly, if you like sci-fi, if you like any of those stories that I mentioned before, like Forrest Gump or Big Fish or whatever, I think this will scratch that same kind of itch that those stories have. That those stories kind of like a unique kind of storytelling is almost a genre in of itself, and this book really nails that really well. But yeah, next I'm going to talk about the characters, because I thought the characters in this book were really strong, and they were a really great, really strong backbone for this story, because the core characters in this book, although Jakob is the only one who gets any real characterization within the direct story, the other characters do get a significant amount of characterization as well, a few of them anyway. We're going to have to talk about those, because those are things that I really liked, because I really connected to the characters in this book. So, we have to talk about Jakob, our main character. His character is explored through flashbacks. A lot of this book is flashbacks. For the first half of the book, probably about 60% of it is flashbacks, because our main character is on a spaceship, and he is by himself, and his mind is fucking fraying. He is not in a good place. Very early in the mission, his wife leaves him because she isn't happy with the situation, and it's not clear why early in, because Jakob views himself to have been a good husband, and all of the flashbacks we see of him with his wife, he seems to have been a good husband. It seems that the mission was with her full consent. She seemed happy to allow the thing to happen. But as the story unfolds, we learn that's not necessarily the case. Jakob is a man whose mind is just breaking from the loneliness, the pressure of the mission, and also the slow realization that doesn't really give a shit about the mission at all. And also he's just kind of becoming depressed, severely depressed. And at some point he meets so basically at the start he's on the ship, and when he sleeps it feels like something's looking through his memory. As he relives his memories, we learn about his life. So we learn about his life as a child in a village. We learn about how his father died when he was very young. We actually experience that the scene that he relives finding out that his father's dead, and we read that. And basically, every important thing that ever happens to this character throughout his entire life, we get a flashback of. Whether it is father dying, the person that his father tortured coming to basically harass his grandfather and try and get retribution and justice for what Jakob's father did to him being attacked for being bullied violently for being the child of a communist informer. He's strapped down on the floor and someone shoves a fucking red hot stick into his leg, and various other awful experiences happen to him. We relive him meeting his wife Lenka for the first time. We relive all these special moments they have together. They have a special place that they go to in a loft of a building. We see them shag on the top of a bell tower while the bells are ringing. You know, we see them go through a hardship in their marriage around the fact that Jakob can't have children. We are led to believe that she really wants a child, but that doesn't necessarily turn out to be the case. We very intimately and vividly get to know this character Jakob. It's going to be hard to read this book and not get attached to Jakob. He is a very flawed person. You know, he's been through a lot of shit. Pretty much everyone in his life is dead. Lenka's all he's got left, and he did not have an easy childhood. But we explore Jakob, we explore his reasons for why he does what he does, and for most of the first third or so, the first quarter of the book, I'll say, he's by himself on a spaceship. And it turns out the reason that he's having these kind of vivid flashbacks is because there's an alien on board with him called Hannes, who is a giant spider that likes Nutella, who's the next character that I want to talk about. Hannes is a character who's in this book from the very early in until about halfway through. And he is an alien from another part of the galaxy that seems to be able to just kind of swim through space. And he's basically been sent, he says, to investigate humanity. And he climbs onto the ship, and he's basically looking through Jakob's memories and experiencing them. And that's why when he does that, Jakob experiences them too. Now, it's a bit of a... it's not really clear if Hannes exists or not. Okay? He's a giant spider alien who likes Nutella, and him and Jakob become very close because he's Jakob's only companion. And towards the end of the first half of the book, Jakob basically decides that he's willing to let himself die. He doesn't really care anymore because the ship's going to blow up, and they get to the chopper, and it's Hannes who kind of gives him the will to live. And Hannes dies halfway through the book. And Hannes is a great character because he's kind of the mentor figure that's willing to tell Jakob what he needs to hear. And there's something just absolutely beautiful, I don't know what else to call it, about his and Jakob's relationship in this book. It is like the ultimate expression of like familial love, kind of. It's like two people who just need each other meet, and it's like the perfect situation for these two people at that point in time, you know, and they just kind of click. And there's something very human about this alien. This alien, you know, got really attached to Hannes as a character, like, very quickly. And when he died, I won't lie, I teared up a little bit. Hannes was like definitely one of the highlights of this book. He dies halfway through the book, unfortunately, and that did kind of suck, because at that point in the book I kind of faltered a bit. I was like, that's interesting. He was like one of the main things I was reading the book for, and then he was gone, and it took me like probably about 30 pages to get back into the book again, almost, after that. But Hannes was a massive reason that this book was so fucking good. Now I want to talk about Lenka as well. So Lenka is Jakob's wife, and she doesn't really get much characterization at all, because she leaves Jakob very early in. But Jakob kind of asks, he's like, look, if you want me to not have a breakdown and manage this mission, he says to Peter, who's the guy who's like running the mission for him back on Earth, he's like, I need you to find her, and I need you to find out why she left me. I just need to know. It's kind of fucked up because they send like an FBI agent to like basically an FBI agent, I mean, not literally, but like a a government agent to sneak into her fucking house and like check whether she's like with another guy and all this shit. And they do, and they find that she's just living her life. She's made friends with this guy. I think it says that he's a gay guy. He has a husband. She's just kind of like finding herself again, having left Jakob. And then Jakob eventually they get a hold of her private, which is really fucked up, but her private therapy sessions with the therapist, who's supposed to be helping her and Jakob make it through this mission, essentially. And she goes on to explain that a lot of the decisions that we've been led to believe were decisions that her and Jakob made together actually never happened, and Jakob actually is misremembering this, and it has he's an unreliable narrator in that he believes himself to be a great husband, and he's not. In reality, Jakob actually just makes decisions for the both of them, and she is basically forced to go along with them. And she basically can't. She just can't reconcile the fact that he chose to basically ruin their lives by going to space and making that decision for the both of them. Ultimately, she leaves him because he has just basically they've gone through their whole relationship and he's made a bunch of major decisions for them, and she never was really consulted and was never like enthusiastically making that decision with him. And that's essentially what she realized. I can't be with him anymore because his whole life is about him. Our whole lives have become about him, and I'm not allowed to be myself. I'm not allowed to live my life. And so what she does, she leaves and she goes to live her own life because there's a good chance Jakob won't survive this mission. And it becomes one of Yakub's major motivations for making it back to Earth because halfway through the book, Jakob is saved after the ship explodes and Harness dies by a Russian ship, essentially, that is secretly on a mission to the Chopra, and no one's allowed to know this ship exists. And he eventually, I'm talking about Jakob again now, but which is not surprising because everything is through the lens of Jakob in this book. But he makes his way back home. Eventually, the ship goes home, back to Earth, and they save him. But it turns out that they're not going to just let him go because A, everyone on Earth thinks he's dead because the ship exploded, and B, no one's allowed to know this kind of Russian ship exists and this Russian mission exists, and so they can't let Jakob go because Jakob might reveal how he made it back to Earth, right? Obviously, people won't just believe that he just ended up back on Earth, so he essentially, when the ship enters orbit, goes fuck it and jumps on the astronaut who saved him and basically fucking just crashes the ship, and he's the only one who survives. And he manages to make it back, and he kind of like he becomes close to this astronaut on this ship. They develop a close relationship, and eventually he decides, you're not fucking locking me up. I need to go, I want to go find my wife. So I want to go find Lenka and I'll be with her again. So he breaks the ship. He crashes the ship, and they end up back on Earth. And this begins this incredible arc, which completely re-engaged me to the story again of Jakob recovering from his physical situation because he almost died from being in space. And also, like, his body was just fucked up because he hadn't been doing his exercising because he was so depressed that he was supposed to do to maintain his body mass. And he basically just escapes Russia. He gets he kind of backpacks throughout the Europe to get back to back home. And he goes to find Lenka, and he does find her. He finds her where she lives now, and was the single most interesting part of the book for me because the book makes it very clear that Jakob comes to understand the reason Lenka left him, and he realizes that she was right the whole time. And he goes and he finds her, and basically he finds her, and she's at like a festival, and she gets up and he goes to find her and he's watching her, and she walks through the crowd past him, and she looks at him and looks past him, and she doesn't recognize him because he's completely changed. He's a completely different person by this point. and he can't bring himself to speak to her. And then he follows her home, and he thinks about, how am I gonna break the ice, you know? And he just waits outside of her house for a whole day, throughout the whole night, sits on the street, and eventually she leaves, and he follows her to basically to a stream in the sun, and she starts painting, and then she accidentally spills some paint in the river, and she's like messing with the paint in the river and looking at it, and she looks happier than he's ever seen her, and so he leaves. He leaves. He doesn't tell her that he's alive, and he decides that he's not going to force his way back into her life. Now, the thing for me about this that was so interesting about this, there's a lot of things in this book that I really love, and I will get onto these because they are very ambiguous and they're very up to reader interpretation. But the thing about this to me is this signifies that Jakob never changed as a person. He because when he chose to leave her and get up and leave and not tell her that he was actually alive, he was actually, in my view, just doing the same thing that he'd always been doing, right? In that moment, he made the decision for her, and he did not ask what she wanted. If he really wanted for her to make an informed decision, and if he had changed, he would have told her that he was alive, and she would have allowed her to make the decision for him to be part of her life again. But he didn't allow her to make that decision. He made that decision for her. Now, this is obviously just my interpretation, but this is a very difficult scene to get your head around, because there's both arguments on both sides, right? Like, there's an argument that, like, you know, she already made the decision for him to not be part of her life by leaving, right? So maybe there is that argument, but for me, it signified that he hadn't changed, and that actually he was just the same guy as he was before. And to be honest with you, by the end of this book, I'm not really sure what the takeaway is here. The ending is very depressing and very bleak. But yeah, I'm getting distracted again. So I want to talk about Schumann. Schumann is a guy who Jakob's father tortured and extracted a confession out of for some kind of thought crime, basically. And he basically takes this guy and tortured him. And one of the ways that he tortured him is he had this iron shoe, and he put his foot in the shoe, and you'd heat the shoe up, and it was a torture method. When Jakob is a child, this man turns up to his house, and by this point he's living with his grandparents because his father has died. And Schumann comes to the house and basically demands that they give him everything. Demands that they give him everything that they own, because it turns out that the house that they live on was given to them as part of a wealthy redistribution program, and it was taken from someone when the communists took over. And he's basically trying to seek retribution because Jakob's father died before he could be sentenced. He was in the process of being sentenced for his crimes while he was a communist informer. However, he died at a ski resort before he could be tried for his crimes. So this guy Schumann never got any justice for the crimes that were committed against him, because the man who tortured him and ruined his life and put him in prison died before he was able to face justice. So he tries to extract some crude, twisted form of his own justice from basically from the situation that he can. I mean, by this point it's very clear that he's a broken, fucked up guy, and he's just trying to make sense of what happened to him. Schumann is a really interesting character because he represents the part of Jakob's personality that he is a physical manifestation of Jakob's guilt. I think he's a big reason why Jakob feels guilt, because this guy harassed him his whole life, but also he can't help but feel like the guy was maybe a little bit in the right about it. And that's part of why he feels so guilty about the situation that his father put them in. There was something about the way that Schumann was written that was just really well done. He was very earnest, in a way, very honest about what he wanted and what he believed and what happened to him. And at the end of the book, Jakob hunts him down again, and it turns out that he's basically going to go to prison alongside the Prime Minister for embezzling funds and being corrupt himself. And in the end, Schumann takes him to where he was tortured, takes Jakob to where he was tortured, and he just gives Jakob everything he owns, essentially. And he's like, have your house back. It turns out that a lot of Jakob's success in life was because this guy ruined Jakob's childhood and felt guilty for it. And he basically helped Jakob secretly at a distance to get into university, to get the job he wanted. And it was him who suggested Jakob as Spaceman to the Prime Minister in the end. He was secretly helping Jakob throughout his whole life to kind of try and make up for the guilt of what he'd done to him. And it's just something about the characters in these books and them having these deeply human, emotive, and illogical motivations for the things that they do. The characters in this book felt very realistic, I thought. I thought they were really interesting. And Schumann barely has a name. You know, we don't find out his name until right at the end. And really stood out to me as a villain. Even if he even is a villain, I don't even know really if I would describe him as a villain. He's an antagonist, I suppose. Those are most of the characters I want to talk about in this book. The character work in this book is really strong. Jakob especially, Jakob and Hannes and Schumann are the three stand-up ones. Lenka does not get much characterization because we don't get any scenes from her perspective or anything like that, but she is characterized through flashbacks, and she is characterized through her therapy sessions that Jakob listens to. Overall, it was really good. I was very surprised because I picked this book up for like £2 in a charity shop, and it really fucking surprised me how great the character work was. It's worth noting that this was the author's first book. So next, I want to talk about the plot. The plot in this book, there's an awesome story here that is being told, in my view. It touches on a lot of ideas, and it does all of them extremely well. But like I mentioned earlier, it's also like whimsical in a way that works surprisingly well. The story takes Jakob through like an odyssey of adventure and self-discovery. Well, perhaps it's better to describe it as an adventure of self-destruction, I suppose. But like I said, it reminds me of other stories like Forrest Gump, Big Fish. The characters go through these incredible tales that just lean into the fiction while being just grounded and also serious and also at the same time absurd. This story has many twists and turns. There were a lot of things that happened in this book that I did not predict. That I could not predict. That I never would have predicted. And the scenes are so enthralling. There is something... I mean, this is more leaning into the prose, I suppose, but like the way that the flashbacks are written, the detail to Jakob's like consciousness, stream of consciousness. I don't know what else to call it other than intimate. You get to know Jakob in a way that is almost voyeuristic, in a way, almost gross in some ways, you know, and yet that just makes you give a shit about him. And this story, some of the moments in this book will stay for me forever, you know. Matched with the prose, such vivid imagery in my mind. Some of the scenes, like when Jakob finds out that his father died, I've never felt before so much like I wasn't reading. I suppose I'm getting into the prose here a bit, but yeah. The story, it says here that this book won some kind of award. It's the guy's first book, and some of the scenes, like I said, Hannes' introduction, Hannes' death, when they're hugging in space, Jakob finding out his father was dead, Schumann coming to the town, Jakob's re-experiencing, like re-remembering his childhood experiences, such as him getting bullied, him meeting Lenka. Is such a memorable scene. Lenka's like such a fucking well done sassy character, and Jakob's recovery after returning to Earth. Jakob's like odyssey of a journey back to his home country from Russia, him formulating a relationship with these astronauts on the Russian ship, and then the guy on there who's gone fucking insane. The only implication, the only other person who may have even met with Hannes is kind of a slight implication that Hannes found the Russian ship first, and one of the guys on the ship is in batshit insane. But it's not clear if the guy did interact with Hannes or not, or if he's just gone space crazy. So this is the only implication that Hannes actually existed in any real capacity and isn't just Jakob going crazy. And you know, I could go on all day about this. It has so many incredible scenes, and this is the thing that reminds me of Forrest Gump so much. Because like you think about Forrest Gump, you think about all the individual things that happens in Forrest Gump's story. Like the him running through the forest, getting shot in the ass, Bubba dying, him fucking running into like him getting his medal and bending over and showing his ass, like all these little crazy little things that happen that are just so memorable and so earnest. It really has that quality to it. The story does that really, really just made it so endearing. Jakob is not nearly as goofy of a character as far as Gump is, but it's the same kind of vibe. The story in this book is, I mean, it's something. It's pretty fucking out there. And a big thing for me is that every chapter felt so important. Like there weren't any throwaway chapters or scenes or anything like that. There weren't any like bits where I was like, that's not that important to the story. Like all of it felt necessary to tell the story. There's no fat in this book. It's been trimmed if it was ever there at all. So the actual story in this book, there's a really unique and incredible story here to be told. It's probably not for everyone, but for me it was really something. It was really something special, and a lot of these scenes will stick in my mind. My imagination of that scene, my mental image of that scene, will stay with me forever. The same way that some of the most striking cinematic experiences from film that I've had will stick with me. And of course, we can't talk about this book without talking about the prose, because the prose is what makes this book fucking incredible. It is the way that it is written, more than it is the actual story that's being told, really. Yakub's flashbacks and memories, the stream of consciousness passages in this book are far and away the most immersive pieces of written prose that I've ever had the pleasure of reading. I have never felt like I am reading a book less than when I was reading this book. The way that this is written, it's like the knowledge just flows into your mind. It's like an experience. It's like I feel like fucking Edward Elric, like in that weird fucked up world where the fucking knowledge is just streaming into his head.
It was like all of the information in the world was being poured into my brain at once. It's too much! It's too much!
It's just streaming at your head. You're just experiencing it vividly, and the prose is very simple. There's no crazy like flowery word. The actual verbiage and the actual words are very simple. It's all about the sentence structure and the way that the story is told to you from the perspective of Jakob's memories. It's just so well done. I'm gushing about this book now because this book really... I've read a few books that are written in this kind of stream of consciousness way, but this is the first one that I've read where it's like, I feel like I'm experiencing telepathy. I feel like I'm experiencing someone else's memories. I feel like Harry Potter stepping into the pensive, and I'm there, and I'm reliving someone else's memories as if they were my own, but I'm also still a passive observer, and I'm not aware of the words on the page. It's just flowing into me through my eyes. I don't know, maybe I've not seen any like crazy praise online for this book. I did do a bit of a Google. I actually saw a few videos about this book online. I didn't watch them, but mostly from what I can tell, people are quite negative about this book online compared to I thought it was fucking awesome. I thought the prose was incredible. But I suppose a big part of that maybe because I had no expectations going into this book whatsoever. I knew nothing about it. I just picked it up from a shelf in a charity shop, and it just fucking blew me away. I mean, I'm not a prose guy. I've made this very clear in most of my videos. I'm not, Brandon Sanderson prose is good enough for me. Like, it's fine. And people often criticize his. To me, like, bland prose is fine. I will take something flowery and imaginative and, something more kind of artistic. I'll take that. And it will elevate the experience, but it's not going to make or break a book for me, For this book, I feel like this was actually the single biggest element that carried this book, that made this book the experience that it was, in a really, in a way I've never experienced with a book. I don't know. I just thought it was fucking awesome. The prose is fucking awesome. This stream of consciousness prose, the way it's done, it's incredible. I loved it, every second of it. So, yeah, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I really do think that the prose is really what made this book so great. It's unusual for me, really. I usually really don't care about that at all that much, but there you go. It's really what carried the book for me. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the themes and ideas that this book digs down into about kind of the human condition in a way that I found to be fucking enthralling. Now I'm not gonna sit here and rant on about themes or anything like that, because quite frankly, it's there's not really any point, because once you get into talking about the themes of a book, you can talk forever. There are two common themes that I picked up on when I read this book, and I want to talk about. These are two things that really were a big part of why I enjoyed this book so much. So I think, in the spirit of 100% honesty about what I enjoyed and what I didn't like about this book, I need to talk about these. So we're going to talk about them. So the first one is the meaning of life, I guess. Philosophy is probably a better word for what I'm kind of talking about. But this book touches on a lot of philosophical ideas, throughout the course of the book. And a big one for me, I noticed, that really stood out to me, was this book leaned into, if you don't know anything about philosophy, I'm not a big philosophy head, but I've read quite a bit about philosophy, and I'm somewhat interested in it. But this idea of absurdism, which is the world, it's a form of nihilism almost, where it's like apart from it's not, because nihilism is fucking cringe, but it's this acceptance that the world doesn't care about you, and that it exists, and you will go through pain and suffering and loads of awful shit. It's just absurd. It's just ridiculous. Life will throw the most ridiculous shit at you. You can try and take life really seriously, or you can just kind of just choose a random thing in life, just fucking roll with it. And you can live to kind of spite the absurd, to live against the absurd, to lean against the absurd, and live in spite of the absurdity of the world, and find your own meaning. And this book really felt like it was exploring that theme, the idea of absurdity to me. And I think that's part of why the story is almost so absurd, because it's leaning into the absurdity of life, the absurdity of these crazy, ridiculous situations that can happen to us all, and yet we're still supposed to find meaning in those ridiculous situations. And sometimes that's not easy. And the ending of this book, I want to talk about the ending of this book. So the book ends, Jakob essentially just basically deciding that he doesn't want to be part of Lenka's life anymore because she looks happy, doesn't want to get in the way. So he returns to his childhood home after he's given the keys to it by Schumann, who took his home from him when he was a child. And he's like, yeah, I never lived in it, you can have it. And so Jakob, remember by this point, Jakob's a fucking national hero. they have like an entire like 2 day long celebration celebrating his achievement, making it to the chopper even though he doesn't survive. He's become a hero of the Czech people, a source of national pride, but he has no interest in that anymore. He doesn't want to be Jakob anymore. He is the Spaceman, and he goes home and he goes to this fucked up house and he just runs around the village, finding a way to live in this old house basically. And it's a fucked up ending. Really, it's a sad ending. It's a awful ending. The situation is horrible, but Jakob seems to find meaning in this absurd, ridiculous situation. You're reading this and you're kind of like, this is horrible. Like, this house is fucked up. It's horrible that what they've done to this house for a start. But he's like energized by it. He's like, this is great. It's a clean slate. I can fix this house up. I can live in it. I can I can sleep on this cum stained mattress that teenagers have been using to have sex on, and and I can get some livestock and I can live here, and he's like, oh, this is great. There's something about that experience was really the kind of synthesis between the absurdity of the situation and him finding meaning in it really leaned into that idea for me. Now, maybe I'm just looking into this to find meaning in something that I thought, because something that I'm quite, I like absurdism. I suppose I have my own version of absurdism where I believe that life has no inherent meaning, and you find meaning in the things that you want to in life. Whether that is pushing a boulder up a mountain forever, or living in your granddad's old shitty houses falling apart. That ultimately you find meaning in what you want in life. I think that's the only way to live. I don't think there's any objective meaning to living. I do reject the idea that life is meaningless, personally. I'm not going to get in a philosophy debate or anything, but what I'm trying to say here is that this book appeals to philosophical ideas that I like. And I liked that about this book. And that's how I kind of was interpreting it in the back of my head, is that this was kind of an expression of absurdism, living in spite of the absurd, spitting in the absurd's face and spitting in life's meaninglessness and learning to find meaning in something that has no inherent meaning. And I thought that was great. It's a really... I finished this book. I don't know very often, but I finished this book. I had to sit down and just strike that pose. I had to be like, when you're like, life just hits you in that way, and you're like, you got to hit that pose. Like that, I was just, it fucking got to me, man. I didn't cry or anything because it wasn't sad. It was just existentially turbulent. It was, I don't know how to describe it really, but it really dug into an emotional part of me that I don't experience very often with fiction. And for that, the book gets, props, because despite the seamless meaninglessness of the situation, this kind of absurd element of the story really shined through for me. That's what I'm trying to get at here. I'm kind of rambling here because I don't really have a script for this one. But yeah, the meaning of life. Is there meaning to life? Do we find meaning in things that are meaningless? Where is the meaning, if it does exist? This book kind of digs into those ideas, and they're not unique themes. I think most fiction tries to make some kind of argument for a way that you should live, or a way that you should consider living, or kind of gives some kind of suggestion for maybe how you should think about the world or something. And this book feels like it's just kind of asking you to think about it yourself. I really appreciate that. The other kind of major theme that stuck out to me in this book was this idea of redemption. One of Yakka's major reasons for doing what he did was because he harbored guilt for his father's actions, essentially. When his father was a communist informer, when he was a child, when Jakob was a child. And the book explores whether Jakob could be redeemed in multiple ways. One that I noticed was that he could be redeemed in the eyes of himself and be to himself, and the other one is to be redeemed in the eyes of others. I think it's pretty clear that Jakob succeeded in that he is redeemed in the eyes of the people, but not in his own eyes, I don't think. It's even to the very end, he still laments his father and how that made him feel. His interactions with Schumann don't really resolve his conflict at all in this regard. It's not clear whether the author's trying to say that redemption is or isn't possible, or whether it should or shouldn't be attempted. I think that, again, it's left very open to interpretation. This is kind of ties into the absurdism element to it. I think it's quite easy to read this in a lot of different ways and take a lot from it, and I think that's part of what makes it really great. You know, you could easily read it as Jakob has been redeemed because the public and people around him don't know who he is anymore. He's been redeemed kind of by dying, you know, and being reborn as a new person entirely, because nobody even knows who he is. You know, you could argue that he hasn't achieved redemption because he's still he still has negative feelings and self-ideation, really, about the situation. And you could say that he's failed to, you know, you could completely and utterly reject that he's failed to redeem himself at all in the eyes of the people, or anyone really, because, you know, I guess the people who originally hated him might still hate him. The other exploration of redemption here is Jakob's interaction with Schumann. So Schumann sought to redeem himself. He wasn't able to find justice for what happened to him, really. He allowed his obsession with it to ruin him, and this is kind of the other side of the coin to redemption, isn't it? I mean, in a way, Schumann is who Jakob wants to redeem himself in the eyes of, primarily. By the end of the book, this guy kind of forgives Jakob and says, look, it wasn't your fault. You weren't responsible for the actions of your father. I just thought the exploration of that conflict was very well done. The final scene, the final confrontation between Jakob and Schumann was brilliant, just as I thought the rest of the book was. The exploration of this theme was interesting and engaging, and it's something that I kept thinking about as I was reading it. It's something that it was kind of bringing into the fore of my mind. That's all I have to say about kind of the theme stuff. I don't want to rant on about themes. We'll move on. The last thing I want to talk about this book that I really liked, the ambiguity. You know, ambiguity can often be frustrating, I think, in storytelling. It is not clear in this book whether Hannes existed. It is not clear whether Jakob really understood why he'd taken the path he had in life and had sought to change it, or had succeeded in changing. And that's one of the things that makes this book so fucking good. I can't stop thinking about it. You know, even to this day, I'm arguing in my head, did Jakob, when he made that decision to not speak to Lenka, was that a confirmation of him accepting her decision, or was that him again making the same mistake? I can't decide. I really can't decide which one it was. And I think that's great. I think that's part of what makes this book so brilliant, so damn good. Same with Hannes, right? Hannes, he has these like little parasites in him called the Gorampeds, I think they were called. And as Hannes dies, the Gorampeds is basically, they have these eggs inside of Hannes' body, and they burst out and they climb all over Jakob. And Jakob, they climb onto him and into him. At least that is his experience, as it's described to us when he dies, when Hannes dies. But then when he's on the ship, there's nothing on him, and they don't mention finding any aliens on him, but he is ill. And then later in the book, a bit later, so you're thinking, oh, okay, well, Hannes wasn't real, because the Gorampeds, they were all over him, and surely they would have found them immediately as they pulled him in or something. And they don't. But then one of the guys on the ship is crazy, and he starts talking about this, like, fucking alien, basically, that, like, entered his mind and fucked with his brain. It sounds just like what Jakob experienced when Hannes was doing that to him. And you're like, also Hannes is real. He must be. And then later on, even further into the book, a Gorenped climbs out of Jakob when he's recovering. And he catches it and he experiments on it a little bit and then he kills it. And nobody else sees this, nobody else confirms it's happening. Is it real? I don't know. I want to believe that Hannes was real and wasn't just a figment of Jakob's strained mind in the situation he was in. Going crazy in space, being alone in a tube, flying through the vacuum of space is not a stretch. It's probably pretty much the standard way of reacting to that situation. A lot of people would go insane if they're by themselves in a situation. It's not clear. I want to believe that Hannes is real. I do. But I don't know if I believe he was real. But if he's not real, does that mean that the experiences that Jakob experienced weren't meaningful? Were they just mindless hallucinations? Were they meaningless? Were they figments of his imagination? His broken mind feeding nonsense to him to stimulate him, to trick him into not being alone, because that was what was breaking him. I don't know. There's things like this that make this book so great. And I will be thinking about that for years and years and years to come. One of my favourite games is a Skyrim mod called Enderall, Forgotten Stories. And that is a game that, if you get the secret ending, points a finger at you and goes, what do you think is true? And it's very much up to you. And I love that ending. That is one of my favourite video game endings, because if you do all the side quests, you read into the lore, one guy has one theory and another guy has another theory, and they cannot both be true. Which one is true? You have to choose which one persuades you more. It's not that one is right and the other is wrong. Which one do you want to believe? But it's also almost like a litmus test for what kind of person you are. It's like, are you an idealist or are you a jaded realist? And there's something beautiful in that kind of storytelling. And it makes you think. And to this day, I don't know which one I think is true. I don't know for sure. Some days I think it's one. Some days I think it's others. And that's part of what I love so much about that game. And it's part of what I love so much about this book. This the ambiguity. It's just fucking phenomenal, man. It's like it's like Disco Elysium. It's another game that does the same thing. And is the ending of that game real? How much of it was real? And how much of it was just Harry's brain? How much of a lot of, like, Inland Empire and Shivers, the skills, how much of that is real? I don't know. But yet it's such an incredible experience to experience those things nonetheless, Jakob and Hannes' relationship was so beautiful and so engaging that I want to believe it was real, but I don't know if it was. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. I fucking love that about this game. I think book. This is a book that will stick with me. I will probably read it again at some point. This is staying on my shelf. If I have kids, this is getting given to my kids. I fucking love this book. In conclusion, a fucking awesome book. I loved it. It was and you know what? It was very different to the kind of thing I'd usually be into. Very different, and I love it all the more for that. And to pick this up off just for £2 in a fucking charity shop, just to pick it up. Don't even really know what it is. Spaceman and Bohemia. That sounds cool. Striking front cover. Nab it, have it, and then to just take a small break from all the fantasy books I was reading after finishing the First Law trilogy, to go from an incredible series of fantasy books to an incredible sci-fi book like this and character piece. Man, what a role. Awesome. I will also be making a video about Warbreaker, the Brandon Sanderson novel. I have finished this. And I will also be making a video about the first 200 pages of Stormlight Archives Book 1, Way of Kings, because that book is so long, I don't want to have to make a video at the end about the whole fucking thing, right? I want to I want to kind of do a read-along kind of way of doing my kind of thoughts on that book. So I'm going to talk about my thoughts on part one of that book. It's about the first 200 pages-ish. And then I'm going to make a final book about my thoughts about it, because those books are big, you know? So they're like, one of those books is almost, it's like a duology, you know, of normal books. Like, it's a trilogy of normal books, really. I mean, if your average book is about 400 pages long, 300, 400 pages long, you know, that book is a trilogy in one. So I want to tackle it piecemeal. If you liked this book, please tell me what you thought in the comments about whether you think Hannes is real, about whether you thought Jakob, what you thought about Jakob's decision to not be part of Lenka's life anymore. Those are two things that I really think about a lot since reading that book, and I just can't decide which one's real or whatever. So yeah, and I'll probably watch the film as well, because there's a film about this book called Spaceman that Netflix made, and Adam Sandler plays Jakob. So yeah, I'll probably watch that as well, and I might make a video on what I thought about it. Spaceman, that's it. Spaceman and Bohemia. What a book, man. God, what a book. Another great book to read. I'm really happy to say, another book I really enjoyed.